If you're new to our channel, we'd love to have you join our little community. Just hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. We promise it will be worth your while.
It was early in spring when Morag finally let me return to Newcastle and back into the care of Diana. She was now satisfied that I wouldn't be a danger to myself and others, and that I was also able to protect myself from some of the darker elements of the magical world. Emily had already returned to her mother to continue her convalescence. Emily was special. She was what the Coven called a sensitive. She may never develop magical powers, but she would always be a part of the magical world, as she had the ability to talk with her mind. After a tearful departure from North Berwick and its wonderful witches, including my fantastic new friends Sally, Wendy, and Morag, I was now looking out of the window of my train as it entered the suburbs of Newcastle. I'd left here as a middle-aged man, but I was now returning as a young woman, and I was really nervous. Once the train had pulled up at the central station in Newcastle, I reached up to get my bags from the overhead storage rack. But even in heels, I was still slightly too short to grab the elusive carrying handle of my bag. "Here, let me miss," said a voice behind me. I watched as an arm reached over my head and grabbed my 2 bags for me and effortlessly placed them into the floor by my side. "Thank you," I said to the helpful man dressed in a business suit. He just smiled and left me. I pulled the telescopic handles up on my bags and wheeled them to the door. On the platform, I looked around to see if Diana had arrived to meet me, but she was nowhere to be seen on the rapidly emptying platform. I headed towards the exit, thinking that she must have been somehow delayed, pulling both of my bags along behind me on their little wheels, whilst listening to the click, click, click of my heels on the hard stone floor as I went. I'd only been wearing heels regularly for about a month now, but I absolutely loved them. In fact, I now loved just about every aspect of being a young woman. With the exception of periods I disliked them, I'd only actually had 2 so far, but the novelty had already worn off. Morag had suggested that I try tampons instead of pads like most modern girls, but I still just balked at the idea of sticking a lump of cotton wadding attached to a piece of string up inside of me. Not yet, anyway. As I walked, I could feel the thin mesh of my nylons gently sliding against the silky fabric of my slip and the tug of the suspender belt as it fought valiantly to hold onto my stockings and keep them up my legs. As I crossed over the wide old cast-iron bridge between platforms on my way to the entrance of the station, I sensed that something was not as it should be. Something was wrong. I looked around at the people passing me, but they appeared normal. I then looked towards the entrance and noticed 3 young men standing 2 or 3 meters apart, trying unsuccessfully to merge into the background of travelers and commuters. It was not the men that caught my attention, however. It was their shadows. Their shadows seemed to have a life of their own and moved out of time with the bodies they were attached to, almost if they were trying to copy their owner's actions. Once over the bridge, I stopped and concentrated really hard trying to contact Diana with my mind. "Diana, can you hear me?" Nothing. I tried a couple more times before taking out my mobile phone and then dialing the number of her cottage. It was answered after 4 rings, but I couldn't hear anything. "Diana? Diana? Diana, is that you?" Finally, I heard a meow. Stupid me, of course. Unless we were linked, she wouldn't be able to communicate with me. "Is that you?" Diana meowed twice for yes. She meowed twice. I noticed out of the corner of my eye the 3 young men now coming towards me. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Diana?" She meowed twice again. The station started to get quiet, and as I looked up I could see that apart from the 3 young men getting closer to me, all of the other people were either slowing or had already stopped dead in their tracks. As the men came closer to me, I could see wisps of blackness, like long, unruly, thick hair trying to break out of their bodies. These young men had been possessed, and as such were not responsible for their actions. They started to speed up, and I just knew that they meant me harm. But as opposed to my previous encounters with the blackness, I was now prepared. I let go of both of my bags, letting them drop to the floor. I now stood before them in my heels with my legs apart. I could feel my skirt and coat billowing in the unnatural breeze I was creating, as I focused my energy and quickly formed a ball of white plasma like energy in front of me. I could feel my hair start to crackle with static as the energy within me grew. Once the ball of sentient energy was fully formed, I released it towards the oncoming men. The ball of energy hit the first man, dragging the blackness from his body as it went. The ball of energy then hit the second and third man, also removing the blackness from them, before leaping up to the roof, bouncing off and then plummeting down through the concrete and granite floor of the station and vanishing. The world immediately returned to normal, as if nothing had happened but for 3 dazed and confused young men sitting on their backsides on the floor of the station. I took my luggage once more and quickly left the station to try and get a taxi. Outside the entrance, as I approached the taxi rank, a large black and very old car slowed down beside me, stopped, and the rear window opens to reveal a pale-skinned woman, possibly in her late 30s. "Magdalene, please get in." I stopped dead and stooped a little more to see who was talking. "Magdalene, we are wasting time. Diana is in danger and I need your help." "Who are you?" "My name is Martha, and I'm a friend." During my time in Scotland, I'd heard the name Martha several times in connection with Diana. Martha had been Diana's magical probation officer, so to speak, following her rehabilitation and her return to the path of light. The car door was opened by a very unusual-looking chauffeur. He took my bags from me whilst I was getting into the back seat and placed them into the boot. He then returned, closed the door, and returned to his post behind the steering wheel. "Thank you, Jeff," said Martha. "Could you now take us to a place of safety near to Diana's cottage, please?" The driver didn't answer, but instead just started the car indicated and pulled away into the mid-afternoon traffic. "I must say you have come out rather well, dear, and if the reports from Morag are correct, you have become quite a remarkably talented and powerful witch." I could feel myself starting to blush, Martha continued. "As you have probably already guessed, Diana has once again gotten herself into a little spot of trouble. In her old body, she would have had no problems dealing with these little inconveniences, but her enemies are taking advantage of her weakened state and have decided to make her pay for the sins of her past. Although this time, I think it may be her old friends trying to get revenge for her leaving them." "Is Diana in danger?" "No, not really, Magdalene. For now she is protected as long as she stays within the grounds of her cottage. I was just on my way to sort the situation out when I intercepted your call." "Oh, and you dealt with those vacants very well and most humanely, by the way. Well done." As I sat in the large and quiet car, Martha explained, "Diana got into some bad company a while back, and as you already know, did some awful things, and after she'd made those responsible for her rape and the death of her father suffer, she continued to run with those bad types. After a while, however, she tired of their mischief and ran away. This did not go down too well with her associates, so she hid in various locations around Scotland for many years, before finally setting up home in Duns. By this time, her attitude had softened considerably, and she slowly started to change for the better." "Is that when you met her then?" I asked. "I've known Diana for nearly 90 years, Magdalene, but it is only the last 40 or so years that we became lovers." I could feel my eyes widen. I didn't really see that coming. "You mean that you and her were?" "Lesbians? Yes, dear, I believe that is what you modern folk refer to us as." I wasn't at all shocked by this, but did fear that I had upset Martha. "Did you love her?" "I am still a young lady, and someday I hope to be reunited with her once more." "But she's a cat now." "Yes, she is, and until she gets a new body, she will remain so." Martha smiled at me. Her smile was soft and almost pleading. "Diana has only a finite time left on this world, Magdalene. She will die when her host body dies. She can never take a more advanced host on it, always has to be inferior, and can only be done with the owner of the body's consent." "So did Diana have to ask the cat permission before she transferred over to it?" "Yes, but she couldn't ask you or I now because we are superior to cats." "Ah, but we can grow her body under special circumstances." I already knew what was coming up, as Morag had warned me just before leaving to return to Newcastle. Morag did mention a little of how it was done. "Yes, she needs a willing volunteer. That is one of the reasons I wanted to meet with you, to plead with you to help us." I was softening to Martha as I could now see tears in her eyes. She wanted so desperately to be back with the woman she loved. "I know of the ceremony, Martha. I cannot promise I will say yes, but I will think about it." Martha smiled as she dabbed away the tears. "And you will?" "Yes, I will remain a virgin until I have made my mind up." The virgin bit was easy, as at the moment I just couldn't imagine ever allowing a man to touch me, let alone submitting to him and having intercourse. "Please don't mention our conversation with Diana, as she has steadfastly refused to ask you." This surprised me, as I had come to assume that the reason I'd been sought out in the first place was for the purposes of her rebirth. As Martha's car approached Diana's cottage, it slowed. The vacant appear to be sacrificing themselves in order to drain the cottage's defenses. "Magdalene, but it is who's driving them that we are more interested in," stated Martha. As the car stopped, her driver got out and first opened her door and then mine. "Let us walk," said Martha as she offered me her arm. I linked with her and we walked slowly towards Diana's small cottage, almost like a mother and daughter out for an afternoon stroll in the park. As we walked, I sensed a little nervousness from Martha, but absolutely nothing from her driver, who was walking at a discreet distance behind us. "Jeffrey is a golem. That's why you are having difficulties reading Magdalene. As he ages, he becomes more human-like and intelligent, but essentially, he is still just animated living clay." "Is he your bodyguard?" "Yes, I suppose he is." As we approached the lane that led to Diana's cottage, I could almost smell the power in the atmosphere, just like the smell you get from the dodgems at the fun fair when the little buggies spark against the metal grid of the roof. Jeffrey grunted and stopped. "Is it becoming too much for you, Jeffrey?" asked Martha. The hulking man in a suit nodded. "Just stay there then and guard the lane then." Martha then turned to me. "Say, the electrical discharges have started to break down the magical bonds binding Jeffrey together. He'll need to stay here for now, I'm afraid." Martha and I entered the lane together, and it became quite obvious that there was an all-out attack going on just down the lane near the river. It was curious to notice that people were still passing by down the lane, oblivious to what was happening. I noticed a tramp coming towards us, in a drunken fashion, but also noticed the telltale mad shadow behind him. Martha held out her hand and flicked her fingers outwards. The shadow tore from the tramp and started to write on the ground before shriveling up and bursting into flames. The tramp fell to his knees, looking bewildered as to how he had gotten here. "Possession? Unpleasant and very illegal," stated Martha as she passed the tramp. We were approached by a woman with a pushchair. She was fine and, like the others, seemed oblivious as to what was happening down the lane. But I sensed something strange in her pram just too late to prevent the small child from leaping out and grabbing Martha by the neck. I grabbed the child as it clung to Martha. I could see the tendrils of blackness trying to infect her as the tiny child dug its nails into her. Holding the small child with one hand and using my other hand in claw-like position, I concentrated and started to draw the blackness from both Martha and the child. Soon there was a large ball of blackness hovering in front of me, desperately trying to escape. The child started to cry. Martha held the child and placed it into its pushchair, whilst I concentrated on turning the blackness into something more useful. When a relieved-looking Martha returned to me, the blackness had now become a glowing white fox. I released it, and it immediately headed along the lane towards Diana's cottage. Martha stood breathlessly and a little stunned by my side as the fox disappeared from view into a clump of trees, and the woman with the child continued on their journey totally oblivious as to what had just occurred. Using children is akin to a war crime, Magdalene. Whoever is behind this has no conscience whatsoever. She then looked me in the eyes and said, "Thank you. I really wasn't expecting that." I then noticed something through the trees on the other side of the small river. A mist. A very light mist that made the trees look slightly out of focus. We continued a little more towards Diana's cottage before Martha stopped. Someone is trying to... She stopped talking. I could also sense something, a presence. The atmosphere became oppressive, and I could feel something happening to the ground. It was getting darker, and the darkness crept up out of the river, and then up the riverbank. It was heading towards Martha, who was now transfixed, and stood like a statue, unable to move or talk. Standing in front of Martha, I pointed my fingers at the ground, and whilst walking in a circle around her, I drew an invisible line into the tarmac road surface. The ground glowed white for a second, before small, thin blue and white flames appeared in a full circle around her. The oncoming blackness touched the circle, but was unable to penetrate it. I stepped out of the circle. The blackness totally ignored me and continued to try and attack Martha. It didn't even seem to perceive me as a threat. Was Martha the actual target of this attack? I thought to myself as I wondered what to do next. As Martha now appeared to be protected from the blackness, I decided to try and find what was causing the strange mist on the other side of the river, so I left her and headed quickly along the lane to a small stone bridge crossing the river. After crossing the small river, I could physically feel the atmosphere change as it became even more charged with magical energy. To my left was the remains of an old banqueting hall, or so the sign I was reading read. I climbed over the small wooden fence whilst wishing I'd dressed more casually today as I snagged my new stockings on a hawthorn bush. As I approached the old building, I was joined once again by the white fox I'd created earlier. I started to hear voices as I approached the open doorway to the ruined hall within. I took a quick peek around the doorway to see 3 people, 2 women and a man. The man was using his arms to create gestures in the air, whilst one of the women was forming the energy created by the man into coherent waves of dark energy. The other woman was almost purple in the face with concentration. "This bitch is strong, Humphrey. I'm not sure how long I can keep her paralyzed for." "What happened to the other one with Stephanie? Do we know who she is?" asked the man casting, the woman concentrating on answering. "Not a clue. I'm not getting anything from her at all. It's like she leaves no footprint." I leant down and whispered to the light fox. "Can you distract the woman on the left for me, please?" The fox looked up at me and appeared to understand. It turned and sloped away to my right. I had no idea how I was going to deal with these people, or even if I was strong enough to take on one of them, but I was going to give it a try, so I once again held my hands out, and between them, a globe of white plasma started to form. I remembered back to the attack on the beach when I'd formed a blob of energy that had fought off whatever had been attacking first Diana, and then after I'd intervened me. This time I wanted my weapon to be scary, but just couldn't get the picture of Scooby-Doo out of my mind. No, not nearly scary enough. I then thought of the large white wolves from a show I'd watched while staying in a refuge last year. Yes, that's it. The energy started to take the form of a very large white wolf. Several seconds later, by my side was a fully formed and glowing wolf. I crouched beside it and ran my fingers down its charged fur. "Attack the man. Disable, but don't hurt him, please." The wolf looked me in the eyes and nodded, and was just about to enter the old hall when I heard a woman's screams from within. "Go! Go!" With that, the wolf sprang through the old stone doorway, closely followed by me. There was total confusion as I entered the old hall. The man was on his back on the floor with the white wolf on top of him, growling menacingly. The fox had broken the woman called Stephanie's concentration as she tried to fight it off, and the other woman was starting to conjure up something dark between her hands. I quickly let loose a ball of cold plasma that hit her in the chest and propelled her against the side wall of the hall, holding her at nearly 4 foot off the ground. I was starting to feel quite smug with myself when I was sideswiped by the woman called Stephanie, as she must have fought off my fox from its attack. I staggered a little in my heels from the psychic blow and momentarily released my hold on the other woman. The 2 women then commenced an attack on me. The woman called Stephanie tried to get into my mind to disable me, whilst the other concentrated on trying to physically disable me with constant barrages of darkness. Using one hand to form an energy shield in front of me, and the other to counterattack, I was having some success. But I knew that I was just suspending the inevitable, as these people were both very powerful and cruel in their intentions. And although I may not have been their intended target, I'd now become an irritating inconvenience to be dealt with. The 2 women started to slowly walk forward, and although they couldn't breach my mental or physical defenses, I found myself slipping on the damp stone floor, as I couldn't get a good grip in my heels. They were backing me against a wall, and I somehow knew that they meant to crush me against it with my own shield. It was just as I was nearing the wall that I heard it, a crump, 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 crump noise, along with the sound of breaking branches. One of the women turned to the entrance, and her expression turned from triumph to total fear as Jeff entered the old banqueting hall. He didn't even acknowledge my presence, but instead went straight over to the woman who was attacking me, picked her up as though she were a twig, and threw her against the far wall, rendering her unconscious. I turned towards Stephanie, concentrated on her attack, and sent her a very loud psychic message, "Get out of my mind." She reeled and staggered back and fell onto her backside. I noticed a small trickle of blood come from her nose, and I noticed redness appearing and quickly spreading in her right eye. My vicious little fox had now faded and gone, and my large wolf was starting to disintegrate. The man called Humphrey started to get up off the ground. He looked a little shocked at his two friends having been disabled. He opened his mouth to speak and raised his arms as if to attack, but got no further, as a long tendril of blue lightning hit him in the chest, and then completely unlike lightning wrapped itself around his chest and raised him above the ground. "Humphrey, I thought you'd learned your lesson. I'm so very disappointed in you." It was Martha. She looked a little disheveled but seemed to have recovered from her ordeal. She turned to Jeffrey. "Subdue them for me, please, Jeff, and try not to rip off any of their limbs." Jeffrey the chauffeur nodded, produced what appeared to be glowing blue string from his uniform pocket, and proceeded to bind and gag the three young attackers. "I've just called for assistance, Magdalene, so I believe it would now be prudent for us to leave these miscreants to the appropriate authorities." Martha offered me her hand, which I gratefully accepted, as I was now feeling a little wobbly on my feet. As we left the old hall and headed back down to the lane, I asked stupidly, "So how did you contact Martha?" She laughed and produced a mobile phone from her jacket pocket. With this, of course,